Okay.
All right, so we are live. So welcome to the next edition of the Cocktail Apocalypse. Hello, Stephanie and Jeremy.
Hello.
Hey Nick. Hi
Hello.
Jer.
Hi.
How are you two doing today?
I'm doing fantastic.
Yeah, good.
Excellent
Right.
today.
Awesome. So today our topic is Election 2024 American Apocalypse. And we thought that to start with, we would look at the historical context a little bit of the apocalypse in biblical literature, and then really kind of hone in on the United States. So, in terms of the context, I think the entire Bible should be read against this backdrop of systems of domination and oppression. You know, you've got
Hmm.
Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, right?
Hmm.
Hmm.
And this is particularly true of the Book of Revelations. And I think a couple of things to kind of tease out of that. And even before Revelation, I think this all begins with the Babylonian exile, where you
Yeah.
have these two themes that emerge, and one is the messianic expectation, and the other is this apocalyptic expectation. And I think it's important to remember that this messianic expectation is that a Messiah would appear, but the Jewish understanding of a Messiah was a king like David.
Hmm.
And so any of the
Hmm.
references to the kingdom of heaven is a reference to a reunited kingdom of Israel and Judah.
Hmm.
Not necessarily God floating down this kingdom onto earth, but it is a an anointed king, an anointed kingdom, and then of course that apocalyptic expectation
Right.
that comes out, at the time of the Gospels were written. So, do either of you have anything you'd like to add?
No.
I definitely you're correct that it apocalypse is always seen in a political context.
Okay.
There's always something um a crisis that is upon a group of people who now have to figure out how to deal with that crisis.
Mm,
And we see it in the Bible. We see the first one in Ezekiel. It's in Ezekiel 37 to 39, where like it's sort of just plopped down in the middle of that book. It
right.
doesn't seem to have a really um, good place there. It's just, suddenly we're into this apocalyptic scene. And during this time that Ezekiel was written, we're in the crisis of the Babylonian exile.
Hmm.
And so you have the people who have been basically, you have the king who has been, Zedekiah, who has been captured, his family murdered, and he is then taken off with a large group of the Jewish population to Babylon. And so you have this crisis of having literally been lifted from your homeland
Mm,
and captured and taken away. So, in this text, you have um, sort of a comforting text in some ways that don't, fret too much because God is going to take care of you.
mm,
Horrible things
Right.
happen. Um, the visionary uh, look at this is also very stunning. It's like a group or piles of bones that come to life and work as God's army. Um, and in that you have this sort of don't fret, this will pass and God will take care of your enemies and
mm,
there will be this great reign back in uh, Israel, where you would have this, better better world.
Hmm.
Um, then we have, in Daniel, the book of apocalyptic text, where you have another crisis that's going on where you have this Greek empire that has come through and has oppressed the Jewish people. But in this context, there's this sort of political uh, vice between the um, Selu- Sil- sorry, the
Seleucids, right?
Solicit.
Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. So you have one from Assyria that is Greek and one from Egypt that is Greek that are, in this sort of dynamic where they're fighting for control,
Hmm.
and the Jews find themselves right in the middle of it. And you have Antiochus the Fourth, who is then um, Hellenizing all the Jews, forcing them to worship him as a god, forcing them to behave in Greek ways and to assimilate rather than to maintain their Jewish identity. And so there you have another crisis where the book of Daniel sort of again shows that, all right, we're going to go through this tribulation. We've done some bad things. God's going to punish us a little bit, but he's also going to save us in the end.
Hmm.
Um, so again, you have this idea of Jewish identity being challenged and this crisis evolving. And then we'll see it again through the little apocalypses in the Gospels, the apocalypse of Mark and Mark 13. You see it in Luke 23 and Matthew 12, where you have Jesus talking about the end times,
Hmm.
and what it's going to
Mhm.
be like. But this is also taking place right either right before or right after the destruction of the Second Temple, right? So this is another crisis for the people, and that's where this literature is going to flourish. And then we see it again in Revelation, um, the fear of Domitian, basically telling the people that they're going to have to worship him as a god.
Hmm.
And whether or not he actually enforced it, which he doesn't seem to have, it was this perceived crisis of we've just had to deal with Nero and the fire, being blamed for the fire in Rome,
Hmm.
and now we have another emperor who's going to force us to do things. So in all of this, we have a crisis of political proportions and religious belief proportions going on.
Right. Yeah, and so Christianity is this. I mean, it emerged out of this messianic expectation and apocalyptic expectation as well. And I wanted to try to focus a little bit though on the United States. And the way I see it is that the United States, the connection with the apocalypse is that early on, this was seen as the New Jerusalem. In a way, it was seen as the fulfillment of the revelation that this is the new land, the promised land, if you will. And this, of course, there are antecedents to Exodus as well in this sort of thinking. But it seems like it's part of the American DNA.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I don't fully understand how that connection is made. How did we become the New Jerusalem?
It was, I think it was just the Puritans who came over. They had this idea of persecution, and I think persecution is a stream that runs through all of this. And they saw this as God's divine command was, that we come over here and they would have the freedom, and then this land was ours. It's the still my brain's a little bit foggy from my cold, but manifest destiny, right?
Mhm.
And it was always seen as sort of the fulfillment of
Mhm.
Revelation.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it also comes out of the Revolutionary War.
Mm.
Um,
Oh.
there's a lot of apocalyptic element that
Mm.
always proceeds and comes after a war, any
Mm,
major war. And
Right.
so worldwide, we were looking at both the American Revolution and the French Revolution
mm,
that kind of
Right.
spurred this on. And in the United States, it was a little different. It was a little more like the self-reliance and aspects
Right.
of there. And I would also say in post American Revolution, we also had the sort of the aspect of the post millennial uh, fever that kind of ripped through the United States as after the war things were going to get better and better, and that's where you really see the manifest destiny coming
mm,
in.
Mm,
This is all the era of abolitionism, the anti prison as punishment movement. So prison reformation, the temperance movement also come out of that. But with it, we also got the manifest destiny, which involved, genocide, because it
mhm,
was
mhm.
Americans' destiny to go through and make, you know, the first
Right.
make America great.
yeah.
Hmm. Steal
Well,
it from the heathens.
yeah. Well, and I
Yeah.
see that as connected more towards this idea of Exodus. I mean, it's hard to and Joshua, and it's hard to separate any of those from Revelation, but it's mirrored the stories especially in Joshua of the Israelites coming in, the Hebrews coming in as an invading force into the land of Canaan. And
Hmm.
God's just like, see that tribe over there, annihilate them,
Hmm.
every last
Yeah.
one of them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, but it's always interesting, and this is just a side comment that for the slaves, they also would turn to Exodus as this idea of freedom,
Hmm. Hmm.
and it is paradoxical in a way that it supported both genocide and these hopes. And I think that there's
Right.
always a sense of hope in a lot of the apocalyptic literature that things are going to change, they
Hmm.
are going to get better for the
Right.
oppressed,
Right.
but it's going to be a lot of bloodshed before you get there.
Hmm. Hmm.
Hmm.
And I also think it's important to note that there was apocalyptic thinking during the Civil War, because when we start thinking about the temperance movement and things
Hmm.
like that, that kind of is post Civil War, I think, for the most part. And the thing that always comes to my mind is the Battle Hymn of the Republic. That is like a apocalyptic text. Mine eyes hath seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Hmm.
He
Hmm.
has trampled out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. And you can
Yeah.
go on, but the whole thing is entirely apocalyptic.
Right.
He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is
And
sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we really see that rise in the beginning of the mid 1800s. In 1837, there's what's called the Panic of 37, which was a pretty nasty economic depression that hit,
Mm,
and it really led to more pessimism. So we went from this idea of the um, post-millennial idea of that we can perfect the United States. We can, Jesus isn't going to come back until everything is perfect, and then there will be this thousand-year reign of peace
mm,
under God's law. And after that, after the depression, that all changed to a more pessimistic premillennial outlook
mm,
in which, no, things are going to get worse and worse and worse, and then Jesus will return and make it all better
mm,
for us.
Hmm.
And then we go into the Civil War with that, and then the idea gets a lot worse,
mm,
that, oh,
Hmm. Right.
things are just never going to get better. It's always going to be worse. And then we go into World War I with that idea,
Hmm.
so it's something that, you continue to have these political and economic incidents that occur that sort of direct where the mindset is. Are we premillennial or postmillennial? And as world wars occur, it gets worse.
Mm.
Right.
You know, with some bouncing back, into a
Mm-hmm.
sort of a post-millennial idea. Oh, yeah, things can get better, and then
Mm.
no, something else happens and it sinks again.
Right.
Yeah. Um, do you want to just jump to the current situation, or is there other? Because I think that just to think in terms of the context is that this is also in the late 19th century is when we start seeing the emergence of Christian fundamentalism that's
Right.
Hmm.
connected
Yeah.
to all of this. And that is specifically a Christian movement in the United States. That's what
Right.
religious fundamentalism really referred to.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it was after World War II, and I don't know that it's fair to say that this is apocalyptic. Maybe, I don't know. Either of you can jump in on this, but it was after World War II when the United States emerged as the great power that it was. Europe was in shambles,
Mm-hmm.
and there is of course apocalyptic elements to World War II, especially for the
Right.
Jews.
Right.
But we have this the state of Israel, and then and we're probably not going to talk about Israel much in this episode, but that's
Right.
worthy
Right.
of another conversation,
Hmm.
Definitely.
especially what's going on now.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened was, the main challenger was communism,
Mm-hmm.
and so you saw this blending of politicians and Christianity and patriotism, where
Hmm.
specifically to battle communism, that to be, because they were godless communists. So you have to be,
Right.
if you're a patriot, you have to
Right.
be Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when we really started seeing a lot of this blending, I think, of
Right. Right.
uh, uh, especially the evangelicals and
Mm-hmm.
politics. And then you get the moral majority in 1980
Mm-hmm.
with Ronald Reagan, and then just on from there.
Right.
And so, is there anything within that? I know this is like really broad brushes.
Right. Right.
Well, I, go ahead, Jeremy.
No, I was just going to say there's also the whole stream of Pentecostalism
Mm,
and the laying on hands and the talking in tongues and the drinking of poison and handling serpents and prophesizing.
mm,
Started in the early 1900s, I believe, is that
yeah.
really that started gaining some strength. And that'll play more into what we're talking about modern times, but that's something that we need to keep in mind as well, I think.
Mm,
I'd also say that just a slight correction that the evangelical movement wasn't just American; it was also British.
right.
And really where we get our intense intensification of it comes from John Nelson Darby, who
Mm,
was British,
okay.
who did a tour of the United States. So
Mm,
he really pushed that in the United States, but it really began there. But there was a kind of a schism between British and American fundamentalism, where initially you had the British who were the premillennialists and the Americans who were the postmillennialists.
mm,
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of merges after 19 or 1837, and then into the Civil War, they kind of merge together
okay.
and become the premillennial aspect of how life is just going to get worse and worse. But the reason that's important is because of the British involvement in the First World War with the Balfour Declaration, which allowed
Mm,
Jews to come back into Israel. And there you have this um, apocalyptic element of the Jewish people returning to Palestine.
mm,
And um, that also sets the stage for what's going on, what will happen in World War II. So that's the only thing I had about that.
mm,
But yeah, as we go further, I would say the next big element that really changes the political religious landscape of the U.S. happened in the late 70s when you start getting Reagan coming into the fold, and you have him merging with people like Hal Lindsey and Jerry
Mm,
Falwell. When you have that apocalyptic language that starts emerging in how we deal with communism, how we deal with the Soviet Union. Reagan really threw that into the fray when he started talking about um, Star Wars
mm,
and started framing a lot of his rhetoric against the Soviet Union with in apocalyptic language.
Right,
Um,
right.
mhm.
yeah.
That's also when it really got coupled with the whole idea of left is non-Christian, right? Versus conservatism is Christian,
I think it
because
starts there because it starts merging
right.
um, the Republican Party with fundamental Christianity.
Hmm.
So it really starts with Reagan.
Yeah.
Right.
Because, I mean, Jimmy Carter was an evangelical,
Hmm.
but Reagan got the evangelical votes. uh,
And yeah, and the reason for that, do you know what the reason is for that?
No, please explain.
Uh,
yeah.
it was that uh, Reagan was very um, pro-Zionism,
Mm,
and Jimmy Carter was pro-Palestinian, and that changed
Mm,
the whole thing.
yeah. Well,
right.
Carter had almost helped resolve the issue of Palestine and Israel, if I remember correctly. But then it got kind of demolished.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
like Obama and Iran and Trump.
Yeah. So we have this merging, and there's a fascinating history. I know again we're kind of brushing this with broad strokes,
Hmm.
but maybe we can do more in-depth episodes later on about all of this because you could do a whole podcast just on that. I think,
Right.
but
And anyone watching, if you want to know more, leave it in the comments so we can read it and follow up with you.
yeah, yeah, and like and subscribe, uh, like and subscribe. Um, so let's look at the current situation
Uh,
because I think it's rather baffling to a lot of people that Donald Trump is, I mean, one, he's using apocalyptic rhetoric in his speeches. He is
right.
painting this vision of the United States as a failed state,
Hmm.
violent state. He's talking about, um, you know, immigrants coming in and slicing your throat in your kitchen. Um,
Right. Eating your
you know,
dogs and cats.
Hmm.
yeah. Um, and it boggled my mind in 2016 that and 2020 that evangelicals for the most part seem to be, not all of them for sure. I have some evangelical friends who are horrified by Donald Trump, but he gets a lot of their votes.
80% at last polling.
Wow. Wow. And everything that he's saying, most of it's just not true.
Right.
Crime rates are down, inflation's down, employment is up.
Hmm.
All of this can be found, but yet he's painting this stark picture and presenting himself as almost like a messiah.
Right. The only one that can fix
Yeah.
this problem.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, he's creating what we would call a perceived crisis.
Mm,
And this goes back a lot to Revelation when we look at John and or the author calls himself John, who is uh, talking about the crisis of what's going on with Rome at the moment is a perceived crisis because at this time there is nothing really. There's no persecution that is sustained going on against them. But there's
Hmm.
a perceived crisis, right?
Mm,
Right.
They think because Domitian has enacted these things, because emperor worship was something that you just did back then,
mm,
Right.
because it helped create people who were loyal,
mm,
um, or push them away, as the case may be. But was there anything really going on? No, not really. I mean, John, who was exiled at this time, was exiled to what today we might call where we send Martha Stewart.
mm,
It was is the cupcake of its time. There was already a Christian community established on Patmos where he was supposedly exiled, and there's no real crisis, but it was built up to be one.
Right.
And
mm,
we're seeing Trump do this right now. He's building up a crisis and almost uttering just absolute nonsense. That stuff that you can easily check and see is not really happening. Is
Hmm.
just the community of Springfield, Ohio, basically just, and all the Republican people coming out and saying, yeah, they're eating the cats and dogs, and no, they're not. The Springfield people are saying, no, they're not doing this.
mm,
Um,
Hmm.
our community is safe. We are not in stress against the Haitian community. They are welcome here. They are good citizens. And Vance and Trump still spreading that rumor that
mm.
they're doing this.
Right.
Yeah, Springfield. I've been to Springfield many, many times. It is
Mhm.
not very far from my hometown. When I was a teenager, I spent quite a bit of time at the Springfield Mall. And I imagine I have friends who have been there recently, probably know people who live there. And I know that there have been bomb threats. There have been other threats of violence in Springfield ever since he said that.
Right.
Mhm.
So the rhetoric is mm, it, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way,
Right. Right.
Mhm.
where it's like, this is what America's like, and it's not that at all.
Right.
And
But
yeah, they're
the
there
believers,
legally.
yeah, the believers work to make it true
Yeah,
in a way.
and he was also in our neighborhood, Stephanie, your neighborhood, at least yesterday.
Yeah.
He was in
Mhm.
Aurora, where he described it as, he's that it's invaded and conquered, and he describes the United States as an occupied state, things like that. And there's a story about the gangs in Aurora, which has been totally debunked.
Hmm.
Completely debunked. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there some unrest there? Yes. Did they take over the apartment complexes? Absolutely not. Yeah. And these things cause a lot of problems for these communities of a backlash, a hatred backlash against
Right.
them for
Yeah.
stuff that they're not doing. And it's, yeah, it's bad.
Yeah. Well, and also I think that further of the rhetoric is that, and this is I think something on both sides, but that you know Trump says if Biden wins, that's the end of democracy. But the
Right.
Hmm.
Democrats are saying if Trump wins, that's the end of democracy. And so it's
Yeah.
being pitted as this like final battle of
Hmm.
sorts.
Hmm.
But and Trump definitely identifies himself to his supporters as their retribution and their warrior.
Right.
And he's like, I'm your justice. And I found a quote that, or not a quote, but something that he posted on Truth Social,
Hmm.
which is specifically apocalyptic. I don't know if either of you have seen this, but
No.
just the first sentence, just alone, I'll read the whole thing, but the first sentence. Now that the seal is broken,
Wow.
I will appoint a
Wow.
real special prosecutor to go after the most corrupt president in the history of the USA, Joe Biden, the entire Biden crime family, and all others involved with the destruction of our elections, borders, and country itself. The seal is broken. That's
Yeah.
apocalyptic language right
Very
there.
much so. Yeah.
Yeah. Right out of Revelation.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And we're facing so much in terms of misinformation coming out. You know, just about everything that he says is a lie.
Mm.
And what it's creating is really what we have been terming the information apocalypse, right? Because no
Mm.
one
Right.
knows what's true, what's not, and it just fuels the conspiracy theory mill.
Yeah.
Hmm.
We already talked about that a couple episodes ago, but it bears repeating here that when you can't trust what's coming from the mouth of a person who's supposed to be the leader of a group,
Hmm.
whether it's the Republican Party or the President of the United States, if you can't trust what's coming from them, then you have no ability to know what's true and what's not.
Yeah.
Right. And that kind of begs. I have this discussion. I go to the dog park every Saturday morning. There's this guy Todd I talk to a lot, and we have this conversation about what is truth.
Mm.
And truth is partially defined by the worldview that you're set in. And if you are in a authoritarian mindset, truth is dictated by the authoritarian, the person at the top of the pyramid. So
Mhm.
that's why people hear what he says and they believe it's true because they're in this mindset that, okay, the person at the top knows what they're talking about. We're going to believe everything he says without questioning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I
There you
think that I always want to, even going back to 2016, I can understand why people would have supported Trump in 2016.
go. Right,
Because
right,
I always say that it was, sort of, throwing a Molotov cocktail into the halls of power.
right.
Because there
Hmm.
was corruption on both sides, and I don't
Hmm.
think there's any doubt about that.
Right,
Hmm.
And, but yet I don't understand after everything that's happened how that can still continue. But I think there are a lot of people that still feel disenfranchised. The
yes,
issue that I see is, especially in this messianic language, an image of Trump as a kind of savior figure, because all the persecution, Christ was persecuted. So they
hmm
see all of the lawsuits against Christ, I mean, oh my goodness, against Trump, um, as evidence that he is actually the chosen one. And
right,
how do you get out of that? Because they don't care that he's been found guilty of all these felonies. They don't care that he's guilty of sexual assault.
right,
It's all just persecution that is evidence for their belief.
right.
Hmm.
But that also brings us back to King Cyrus, right? Because King
Yeah,
Cyrus was not a Jew, but he
right.
saved the Jews.
Yeah, and
So it
that's out
doesn't
of
matter whether Trump is a good person or not, if he has the political power to save them from the oppression that they're facing.
right.
Yeah, and for those who don't know who King Cyrus was, during the Babylonian exile of the Jews, King Cyrus is basically the one who comes in. He's Assyrian, correct?
I think so. Yeah.
Um, yeah, he comes in and defeats the Babylonian Empire and basically lets the Jews go back to their homeland, to Israel and Judah. Um, and So while he is not of the Jewish people, he is someone who's an active agent in allowing for them to return back.
Mm,
So it's seen that people like Trump are like King Cyrus.
mm,
He's a catalyst for something greater,
Right.
a greater cause. And some people see him as Cyrus, and other people see him as more messianic, as
mm.
a David or a Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. Jerry Falwell Jr. compares him to King David.
Oof.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, and David, I mean, David was imperfect.
Right.
He adulterer. He hired
Right.
someone to have an opponent killed. Um,
Right.
yeah. So, um, but yeah, it's this idea that he's imperfect, and how do we get out of that loop though? Is there any way out of that loop? Because we often hear, people say that, the Trump's followers is like a cult, and there is that sort of aspect, especially when you get this messianic expectation part of it. How do we get out of this? Does it have to be some conflagration, that happens? What? I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough to know.
I tend to think it is. I mean, where you see the bubble burst is when things go really, pear-shaped.
Yeah.
Mhm.
They don't work out. And, we saw it in the mid 1800s with the Millerites, who were an apocalyptic group who believed that the end would come around 1844. And that didn't quite pan out. And what happened was, they had not prepared anything for the coming winter.
Mm.
And because of that, you know, when the end didn't occur in October of 1844, they were left with, a lot of people were left with absolutely nothing. And the group
Right.
pretty much either people just left or people committed suicide or people just were in despair, and they had to reorganize and become something else. And what they became were the Seventh-day Adventists. Um, and they revised their entire cosmology over that.
Mhm.
And I don't think that things like this really end well, ever. If you
Right.
have a
Right.
very specific person who is the messianic figure and nothing happens in the end, or God help us that he wins, um, it might carry on for a bit. But I think eventually these things only fade through some sort of immense crisis
Mhm.
that causes a disillusionment in the whole thing, and then it
Right.
breaks apart.
Right. There's something like 700 Trump positive prophets operating in the United States right now. Something like
Oh
700.
wow.
And most of them were predicting Trump's win in 2020. And when that failed, two things happened. Number one, some of them came out and said, I'm sorry, I was wrong. And they lost followers, they lost money, they got hate mail, they got death threats. The others that said, no, we have to modify this prophecy and change and pivoted it. So that's, no, he's going to be reinstated in March, or no, he's going to be reinstated in such a blah, blah, blah. But it's interesting that even the prophets themselves were not in charge of the prophecy. It's really something that's swelling up from the ground. There's something in the people themselves that really need to believe this. So even if we take it on to the head, even if Trump somehow fails, he loses the election, he gets put in jail, he admits everything that he did was wrong or whatever, that whatever is driving this force will not dissipate, I don't think. Because there are already people predicting that Barron is going to be the next Trump. He is the real messiah figure. Barron Trump, his son.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So
what is going to stop this? I don't know.
yeah, as I said, I don't see anything stopping it except an immense crisis that occurs. Like for Hitler, it was basically his demise, his death. He didn't survive the end of World War II. Nazism did to an extent, and it altered a
Right.
little bit, and some of it moved to
Mm-hmm.
South America. But um, this crisis of World War II and the Holocaust kind of destroyed it. Um, so we thought, we're seeing the
Right.
reemergences of it now. So it didn't ever really quite die.
Right.
It
The, Im-
reemerged.
the impulses that drive it are still there.
Hmm.
So I think what we have to do is find out what those impulses are and address it on that level.
Well, I think apocalypse is archetypal. I mean, it's we've had this for a couple thousand years now, and it just keeps changing form. My current worry is, what are we going to get? Some kind of modification like you saw with the Millerites into the Seventh Day Adventist. So is MAGA going to transform into something else, or are we going to get something like Waco or worse? you know. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either, and I think
Yeah,
we're just going to have to basically see how it plays out in
yeah.
order
Hmm.
to really know. We can guess it might go this way or that way, but I don't think the Kamala Harris becoming president is going to change the fact
Mm-mm.
that MAGA exists.
You're right.
Right.
Um,
Just like Obama becoming president didn't erase the racism that exists in our country.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
It made it
Uh,
worse, it seems.
In some ways, they brought it to the surface. I think is what
Yeah,
happened.
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
I would agree with that. It brought it to the surface, and I think you have Trump allowing that sort of rhetoric to continue because he
Hmm.
legitimizes it.
Right.
Yeah. Um, I'm curious. I don't know how to phrase this question, but I think that one of the things that is really important to think about in terms of, I don't know how to phrase this really, because and maybe this is a topic for a whole other episode, but it seems that what is also happening here is a kind of apocalypse for women.
Mm,
Because I think that women are going to likely determine the outcome of this election, and
right.
they're rightfully kind of furious about this.
Hmm.
But I'm curious about the role of women in apocalypse or apocalyptic thinking in terms of history.
Mm,
Do either of you have any insight into that?
no, this is something I know nothing about, but it's an
Um,
interesting question.
I think women tended to drive the more post-millennial.
Mm,
Uh,
Mm,
Within Christianity, they were a big driver in the temperance movement. They were the
right,
big driver in the abolitionist movement,
right.
all that prison reform.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw that come out more in post-millennial. In pre-millennial, we are seeing people, women, rise in terms of that. We're seeing people like Amy Coney Barrett as
Mm,
the very anti abortion. She's a member there, and it's almost like very Handmaid's Tale. Some of the stuff that she is
yeah.
involved with is also has like Handmaid's Tale type of, like, they're actually called handmaidens.
Wow.
Um, uh, so we have seen that. Um, but in terms of groups of women driving things, it seems more in terms of the pro-choice movement.
Mm,
So I'm not seeing it too much in religious terms,
mm,
but I am seeing it in political movements of women just angry,
yeah.
just of losing your rights and
Yeah.
um, fighting back.
Yeah, well, and I think that's the concern, especially with this idea of the Project 2025. It seems like they're looking at Margaret Atwood's *Handmaid's Tale* and saying, "Hey, that's a good idea."
Hmm.
yeah.
There's one of the things I do is I was really curious several years ago about people who leave Christianity, this sort
Mm,
of deconversion. So I follow some people on YouTube, and one of them, his channel goes by Holy Kool-Aid, and he has really come out with he's kind of turned to the politics in this election. He does a lot of debunking things, and he went through Project 2025 on one of his latest videos, and he's just highlighting everything. And it's really interesting because there is some sort of pushback also from the evangelicals, because some are saying that, he's no Cyrus, he's not David, and he is Trump is the furthest that you can get from being Christ-like.
Right. Right. Yeah. So maybe an antichrist?
Yeah. Well, let's think about that for a minute. I think that since we were talking about women, this might be a good time to share Jeremy's latest cocktail recipe.
Oh, yes.
The Ruth Bader Ginger. All right. So let me see if I can pull that up. And maybe.
Let's make the Ruth Bader Ginger. Hi, I'm Jer. Welcome to Kill Devil, where we focus on rum and cocktails. Today we are going to make the Ruth Bader Ginger. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning to the channel, welcome back. In either case, I hope you enjoy this drink. This drink was created by the food author, Ronnie Fine. Ronnie was having a discussion with her daughter about Ben & Jerry's ice cream. And at the time, 2015, there weren't any Ben & Jerry's ice cream flavors named after women, but a lot named after men. Throwing names back and forth, they came up with a name for an ice cream, the Ruth Bader Ginger. However, Ronnie Fine does not make a lot of ice cream, so she decided instead to make a cocktail named after Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Ruth Bader Ginger, and this is that cocktail. A note on the rum. This recipe calls for a dark rum. It is very spirit forward, so I'm going to suggest a nice dark rum. I'm going to be using Appleton Estate, their Rare Casks 12. But find a dark rum that you enjoy and try it in the drink, and if it turns out well, let me know in the comments down below. To make this drink, I'm going to start with 1.5 ounces of the rum. 1.5 ounces is 45 milliliters, and I'm going to put that in a shaker. 1/2 ounce of ginger liqueur. 1/2 ounce is 15 milliliters. 1 teaspoon of fresh squeezed orange juice. 1 teaspoon is something in metrics, which I'll put in the subtitles down below. I think it's 5. Finally, 1 or 2 pinches of ground cardamom. Now, I find 2 pinches to be too much, so 1 is what I'm going to use, but try what you like. Add some ice, and give it a shake. They suggest a stemmed glass. I'm going to use a coupe. You could also use a Nick and Nora or a cocktail glass, but they also said to put a couple ice cubes in first, so I'm going to do that. 2 is perfect. 2 is a couple. Just double strain that into your glass. And garnish. Garnish with a twist of orange. Express. Wipe. And a mint leaf. Wake up. Carefully placed, obviously. And there you have it. The Ruth Bader Ginger. Drink with good spirits. Question of the day. Do you know any other rum-based drinks that are named after a woman? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know what they are. Note that there are ways to support the channel if you're so inclined. I do have t-shirts. If you want a t-shirt, contact me through any of the social media links down below. We'll make sure you get a t-shirt. And while you're at the social media link, you might as well follow me on those as well. Finally, if you made it this far, give me a like, give me a subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss out on anything that I do. And until next time, cheers.
That sounds delicious.
Oh yeah,
it's really good. It's really good.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I like ginger, so I've never heard of a ginger liqueur.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep, they're out there. That's the only one I could get at my local liquor store, so that's one I use. But I'm sure there are others.
Yeah, I don't know any other rum drinks named after women. I'm not all that familiar with rum drinks. Is there a zombie Shirley Temple or something?
I don't know, but I'm going to make one now.
Okay.
Let me take a note.
Yeah, I think if we go back to the idea of talking of of women and what's going on in our world today. I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg is one of the people who, when she passed away, um, so many of us began to just
Hmm.
fear what was going to
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
And, all of our fears came to fruition. We weren't being, hysterical
Right.
about it.
Right.
It came to pass. And so, yeah, anyways, good
Hmm.
drink. And I'm
Yeah.
glad it's named after her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She deserves one.
For sure. For sure. So let's go back to this idea of Trump and the Antichrist. Because, I can't think of anything about him that is Christ-like.
Right.
There doesn't seem to be a lack of compassion. There seems to be no humility. He openly embraces greed.
Hmm.
And it's just, how in the world is this person like Jesus? Other than being persecuted by this make believe perceived enemies.
Yep. Persecuted.
Well, I'll be honest. I'm no Christian, but Trump started making me think, well, gee, maybe they got something right.
Right. Think of him as the Antichrist. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's also
Yeah,
the whole idea of the false prophets, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, over 700 prophets operating, supporting Trump at this point.
Yeah.
And how many, and they've done analyses of their predictions and how many come true. It's a very low percentage.
Yeah.
So
Well,
what are they channeling when they're saying these things? It's
well,
not God.
yeah, and then isn't the Antichrist supposed to be just like full of lies?
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen comparisons of the mark of the beast with the, Make America Great Again on their forehead.
Yep.
yeah, yeah. There's also recently been the fact that he had been clipped by the bullet on his
Oh, yeah.
ear, and Nero having the head wound.
Mm.
And the Antichrist is supposed to have the head wound. So,
Mm.
so there's a lot of thought going around that too. Um, I I don't think it's incredibly prophetic that you get the rise of someone who is absolutely just the worst every once
Mm.
in a while.
Right. Right.
And in fact, our politics, the way we've been practicing it in the last century, have probably been all accumulating towards
Mm.
the rise of someone who
Right.
is exactly like Trump. I mean, people
Mhm.
have been predicting such a thing for, decades now.
Right.
And here we are. So
Mhm.
is it prophetic or is it inevitable?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's kind of how I always read the Book of Prophets anyway, is that they were looking at the current events through the lenses of their own religion. I always think of them as kind of like the talking heads that we have on television, who are always interpreting various events through their political lenses. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. And so if you like write all those down and then retrospectively say, okay, well, I'm going to
Right.
take all the ones that were right,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to seem prophetic, you know?
Mhm.
So, yeah, I don't know. Um, I also
Yeah,
see. No, go ahead, Steph.
I was going to say there's also the idea that if we look at the books of the Bible and we look at the books of any of the religious texts written in the ancient world, I mean, they're all massive PR campaigns. Yeah, so you're right.
Yeah,
They are. A lot of it is, they're the talking heads of their time.
yeah,
They're the people relating the news, and it's it's why we get a lot of the text that basically says those people over there, they eat babies.
yeah,
Or they
It's
eat
a
pets.
PR campaign. We don't have any incidents of any culture out there in that area of the world eating babies.
Right.
It's once you accuse them, now they have to be on the defensive. So,
Right. Right.
they're eating the cats and dogs.
Mm-hmm.
How's that different?
It's not.
Yeah.
And that in particular is something that's been levied against immigrants for, who knows how long. I remember being in high school with the Vietnamese all coming over, and they're saying, "Oh yeah, they eat cats, they eat dogs, blah blah blah." It's something that it's a way to dehumanize and to show that they are outside of the
Mhm.
existing social structure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're not of us.
Right.
Well, and the whole eating of the babies, that is anti Semitic anyway, because that's
Hmm.
just a
Hmm.
repetition of the old blood libel
Right.
that,
Hmm.
Jews were murdering Christian babies.
Hmm.
It makes me think of, with the immigrants, you had what's been referred to as the Jewish problem throughout European history. And that is a problem of immigration in many
Hmm.
ways, right?
Hmm.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. And there's a demonization, and I think it's a black and white kind of thinking, and us and
Right.
them thinking
Hmm. Hmm.
that fuels this apocalyptic fervor.
Right. Yep, agreed 100% with that. And it has to do, I think this kind of gets to the root of where this goes, is to the lizard part of our brain. There's a part of the brain that really, I call it the lizard part, but it's the basal instincts,
Hmm.
right? It's a black and white thinking. If you're threatened by something, you need clarity and you need to respond immediately. So there's no time for nuance. There's no time to understanding the bigger problems. You need to know who's your enemy, who's your friend, so you can respond appropriately.
Hmm.
And they've done studies on this that shows that people that think largely in black and white use this more basal part of your brain rather than the prefrontal cortex where the complex thinking
Hmm.
resides.
And I also think it's easy to kind of dip into that fear on
Hmm.
a much wider scale,
Hmm.
because once you have a perceived threat, you're gonna react to it somehow.
Right.
There are people who can sit there and reason it through and say, well, maybe this isn't exactly what's going on. But when there's a lot of other crises happening at the same
Right.
time,
Right.
we have right now, what do we have? We have a lot of inflation. We have a lot of storms. We have a lot of
Hmm.
fires. A lot of things going on that's creating more and more of an actual crisis that's going to lend itself to that fear portion. Going, oh, these
Hmm.
people are going to they're not going to give us the money to rebuild, and they're going to just give it to immigrants instead. It's
Right.
easy to scapegoat at that point.
Right. Yeah, and that brings us to the way the brain functions in affective states. Once your brain is in a certain state, it looks for reasons to justify that state further. So once you're in a
Hmm.
fearful state, your brain constantly looking for reasons to continue to be afraid to maintain that state.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Confirmation bias, something called.
Mm.
Yeah. And I just want to make a few things, notes here. And this I took from Heather Cox Richardson. I'm on her mailing list, and she's a historian. I forget what university, but she comes out with a almost daily, not quite daily, newsletter, letters from an American. And I really appreciate her work because she gives everything into context. But in her latest note, she cites a Labor Department report from, I guess, yesterday that showed that inflation has dropped again, falling back to 2.4%, which is
Hmm.
the same it was before the coronavirus pandemic.
Hmm.
And then the Dow Jones Industrial Average jumped 400 points to a record high.
Right.
And the S&P 500 closed above 5,800 for the first time.
Hmm.
And she also notes a Washington Post economics columnist, Heather Long, that just by about, this is a direct quote, by about every measure, the U.S. economy is in good shape.
Right.
Inflation is back down, growth remains strong at 3%, unemployment is at a low of 4.1%, and the U.S. has created almost 7 million jobs, more
Right.
than it had before the pandemic. The stock market is hitting all time highs. Americans are getting sizable pay raises. Middle class wealth has surged to record levels. The Federal Reserve has begun to cut interest rates, and it says that foreign leaders are starting to talk about the U.S. economy with envy. That is
Right.
very antithetical to the image that Trump is
Hmm.
presenting.
Right. And just like the dips in violent crime, et cetera, that all that stuff is opposite of what he's saying.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when you bring that up, he'll just say that the FBI is lying.
Right. Mhm.
Yeah, but I think to look at the other side a little bit here, when we hear that the stock market is booming,
Right. It doesn't
um,
mean it's booming for people at the bottom.
Truth
yeah,
doesn't
it
have
doesn't mean
stock.
it's booming for many of us. And
Yeah.
when we look at inflation going down, we're not given a really broad spectrum of it.
Yeah.
We're basically given a high level view of it, which means that it's not necessarily a true indicator of what we're actually experiencing. I mean,
Right.
I've gone to the grocery store just yesterday and just buying a few items, it's still high.
Yeah.
You
Right.
know, it's not coming down for us, for a lot of us. And that
Mm.
might not be due to an inflation problem, but it might be due to some other factors out there, like
Right.
people not
Corporations gouging people.
Right.
exactly. And so it's easy to divert that to, oh, it's an inflation issue and it's because of this administration.
Yeah.
Right.
Um, that may or may not be true. I don't think it's true in this case. But I think we have to look at the fact that, a lot of people are having a hard time getting by, and that's fueling
Right.
the fear.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And I think that that's what I was trying to express a little while ago is that, when I said that I understood how people could support Trump in 2016, I think the same is at play now that people are suffering
Right.
and they are looking for a way out. And
Hmm.
so they're grasping at anything they can find because the system is broken in
Right.
many ways. And it's not helping people the way it should be.
Hmm.
But I think the problem is that there's so much misinformation and disinformation that it's where they're putting their hope is not a place that they ought to put hope.
Right. Hmm.
Yeah, the sins of one administration isn't doesn't show the greatness of the other one.
Right.
You have to look at both of them and what each of them are doing and judge from there. You can't, you know,
Right. That
the
either
the,
or
the
mentality.
yeah, the sins of the Democrats isn't the salvation or should not be the salvation of the Republicans.
Right.
It's not that simple.
Hmm. Right. But because we're locked in this simple dynamic, it's good or it's bad, and Democrats are viewed as bad. Therefore, the Republicans have to be good.
Hmm.
And likewise.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And likewise. Um, it, what do you think is going to be the outcome? I'm just going to put you on the spot here. What do you think is going to happen during this election and after?
Hmm. I suspect no matter who wins, there's going to be violence.
Hmm. Yeah.
If And I think in either case, it'll come from the Republican side. Right?
Uh,
Trump has already said that he wants an hour purge for police where he can go out and kill and do what they want to criminals.
Yeah. Well,
So if
he's.
he wins, what's going to happen? People are going to go out and punish people.
Hmm.
My suspicion.
yeah,
Maybe it won't true, but and if Harris wins, we're going to see another January 6th.
yeah, I agree with Jeremy. I think um, in this context of no matter who wins, there's going to be problems. I suspect if Harris wins, we will see something akin to the January 6th, only probably worse.
Hmm.
Um, I I actually think that I'm going to make a prediction. I think Harris is going to win, and I
Hmm.
think she's going to win on the backs of women, who have seen what has happened in the past number of years and are just simply horrified
Hmm.
um, by what's happening to women who have miscarriage, who aren't allowed to receive the medical care that they need, to doctors fleeing states that have enacted abortion bans. Um, so I do think that we will see a Harris win. I think it might be larger than what people suspect right now. I'm not sure it's as close as people think. Um, but regardless, whatever the case is, I think the end is, it's not the end, it's the beginning of something else.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to agree with all of that, and I think the polling is probably off. I don't know that we can trust polls
Mhm.
anymore,
No.
um, because it used to be with the landlines, and now the only people who still have landlines are probably above the age of 60 or above the age of 70 even. And people don't, I know that when I see a call coming in, it tells me, likely scam or it's not a number I recognize. So I'm not going to pick up. So they can't have a representative sample because of that.
Right.
And I don't know what's going to happen with polling. I mean, we're still looking at it, but I don't think that it's valid. I don't think it gives us any kind of strong predictions anymore.
Right.
Yeah, I
Right.
agree with that. Um, and I guess it bothers me that we knew this through the last two elections,
Yeah.
and we still haven't fixed it. You
Right.
know, it's like I understand that things move slowly, but it blows my mind that we haven't figured out a better way for polling at this point.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that we can, to be honest. I think that there may be, yeah, because you can't rely on internet polling because that's a self-selected bias.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose that you could try to send out emails to say, hey, fill this out. But again, that's going to feed into self-selecting bias of people wanting
Right.
to report things. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe we're seeing the death of polling.
It could be.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, you could activate the microchips that are implanted in us with a virus and get pulls that way, right from our brains.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
Sorry.
Duh.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, I don't know. I tend to agree with Steph. I think that we are in for a world of hurt. I think there's going to be bloodshed, unfortunately. And I just don't know what's going to become of MAGA. I imagine it
Mhm.
will transform into something else, but I don't know. I think we are
Right.
in a very unique position in American
Mm-hmm.
history.
Agreed.
Yeah. And
Heavy thoughts with Nick.
Yeah. So I know we've been at this for a little bit over an hour, and we usually go an hour to an hour and a half. Is there any like final words that either of you have? Anything that we haven't covered that we probably should have?
Hmm. No, I
uh,
think I'm good.
no, I think we covered most of it. I don't know if we want to go any more into the disinformation campaign going out there. Stuff that we've seen most recently with the hurricanes and
Right.
Right. Right.
all of the misinformation going on about money going out, who it's going to,
Right. Right.
uh, the fact that the big one that the government is directing the hurricanes. You know,
Yeah.
it's
Oh my
Yes.
God.
they've
Space.
specifically been seeded to only
Hmm.
somehow affect Republicans.
Yep. Surprise,
Yeah.
surprise. The space laser lady thinks we can control hurricanes.
But here's the thing: they're so close to grokking onto this notion that humans are changing the weather.
I know. I
Humans are
know.
changing the climate. And it's like, but it's not a conspiracy.
Right.
This is something that's actually occurring, but no one's in control of it.
Right.
We can't direct the hurricanes.
I
Hmm.
saw a meme recently of people or someone saying, "I found the machines," and it was just a bunch of industrial
Yeah.
buildings releasing
Yeah.
pollution into
Yep.
the air.
Hmm.
Yeah. I've seen
Um,
that too.
uh, So yeah, but the scariest thing is when I actually encountered on a NOAA site, while we were tracking Milton, people posting their own pictures that they got from, I don't know where they got them from, what satellite, of the hurricane, and showing, can you see? They shouldn't look like this. There's obviously something wrong with these hurricanes in the eye wall. They're being directed.
Yeah.
So I saw in real time people really grasping onto that idea that the hurricanes are being controlled.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's widespread, very widespread. And that to me is terrifying in the idea of the information apocalypse there, that we really can't trust anything coming out because someone's
Right.
co-opting whatever it is to fit a certain agenda. And then we have AI on top of that. And that's
Right.
causing so much strife
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
within, what's true, what's not true. Um, and, then Trump and Vance at the center of it saying, oh, yeah, they're doing that, and feeding it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I should mention that Project 2025 calls for the dismantling of NOAA.
Right.
Yeah.
And FEMA.
Hmm.
Yeah. And FEMA for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of these things. And it is that's a dystopian worldview. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for anyone who doesn't, I don't want to live in Gilead. That's just no, no. Um,
Yeah.
And, no matter who wins, again, I don't see any correction to this at this point
Right.
until, you know, I honestly don't know what a correction would look like at this
Mm-hmm.
point. How do you crack down on that without becoming
Becoming
something scarier?
right.
well, here's the question I have because we're focused on obviously this is the American election. And you've mentioned before, Britain, with the Darby and his influence. But most of Europe has been, not all of Europe for sure, but much of Europe has become much more secular.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see the same things
Right.
happening
Right.
there. They may have versions of apocalyptic ideas, but in a secular society, you're not going to get that much. So it seems that, and I think that's something to look at in the United States because we do have, this evangelical movement, but at the same time, it's bleeding members. The largest
Mhm.
group now in demographic, at least the last time I double checked, was people who are fleeing the churches and
Mm-hmm.
identifying as spiritual but not religious. And so maybe the place is going to be on a more secular nation. Maybe that's what's
Right.
going to resolve this.
I don't know because we have a lot of going on in Europe right now that is fascist.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
And and I think you can't ignore the fact that political agents can become very religious in nature, and we
Yeah.
saw that in the Soviet Union.
Right.
Right.
Um, Political ideology and religious ideology share
Yeah.
in sort of scapegoating and
Mm.
scapegoating. Sorry,
Gape
and
squirting.
um,
That's great.
so you, you know I don't think that necessarily secularization is accurate
Mm.
because if you have a identification with your political party
Mm.
that goes to you yourself, then you're also setting that up as a belief system.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
And tell me what the difference is between that and a religion.
Right.
Right.
Maybe not a supernatural element, but certainly religious aspects to it.
Yeah. Yeah. So would you tie this rise of fascism to a kind of religious ideology?
Uh, I think so. I think it becomes that, but I think it has its roots in, again, as Jeremy pointed out, that fear.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right.
that black and white thinking that comes out of fear. And I think a lot of the fear is driven by what we're starting to see with climate change.
Yeah.
Um, you know, you have flooding and drought just decimating crops, the rise of food. You know, we don't really talk about it here, but it's always seen in the aspect of inflation being driven by corporate greed. And to an extent, that's true. But to an extent, it's also we have less food,
Yeah.
you know, because the crops aren't growing the way they should, or they're being knocked out by a flood or
The fisheries
a
are
drought.
collapsing, or
Yeah, you know,
Mhm.
and when you have that fear rising because there's less and less to go around, then yeah, you're going to look at the person in the town next over and say, they're eating babies. We gotta save ourselves, and you know, we might
Mhm.
just take their stuff too when we're done with that. You know, it's I unfortunately see a lot of this rising out of fear-based things, and I think
Right,
that if we're going to get out of it, we're going to have people actually address the problem. You know,
right.
not skate around it, not
Mhm.
do lip service to it. Yeah, we're gonna fix these things with climate change, and then nothing really gets done.
Right.
Or, you know, it's just a little lip service to it. It
Yeah.
has to be addressed.
Yeah, that's the specter that's behind everything, I think, is global climate change. And
Hmm.
it seems to me, I was looking at a map on the Weather Channel the other day of temperatures in the United States because this is, I love summer. I'm a summer person, and fall's beautiful, but I hate winter. I just can't stand the cold. But
Mhm.
it's very unsettling when I look that across the nation, it's temperatures in the 80s and the 70s because Colorado,
Hmm.
where Stephanie and I are, we almost always get the first snow before Halloween. And
Yep.
now I read that it's being predicted that we're not going to get it until November sometime.
Yeah. Probably
Wow.
maybe before Thanksgiving,
Yeah.
but not necessarily. You know, some
Yeah.
people are saying maybe not till December.
Yeah.
So, and it's currently 78 degrees here.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
that is unusual for Colorado this time of year.
Hmm.
We can get 70-degree days in December. I remember that, but they were rare and few and far between.
Right.
Hmm.
But that was also always after we've had snow.
Mhm.
So I do think that a lot of the fascist movements out there are because of fear of what's going on. We've, I think we've been spared a lot of it when compared to other places in the world,
Mm,
especially the southern hemisphere. Um, but we're not being spared anymore.
right.
And I
Right.
believe that is, you know, driving people towards people who will, or leaders who promise everything. They promise the world to you and spew anything that sounds good because people are so fearful, they want to cling on to anything. And if
Right.
you appear strong, they're going to even, you know, cling to you more.
Mhm. Right.
But I think we're starting to see some of that fall apart, you know,
Mhm.
that these people don't really have answers.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that might be another reason why we're being, um, you know, there's some hope that uh, Harris may win the election because we're seeing, you know, people, you know, we're seeing a lot of Republicans for Harris, right? Because even
Right.
they are starting to see, oh, this is not sustainable. This is
Right.
not good. They're
Mhm.
lying about everything.
Mm,
So as much as it drove people to it, I think ultimately when there's nothing delivered on and it
Mhm.
starts falling apart, people will also flee those types of ideologies
Right.
that really show they're not really doing anything. They're not
yeah.
helping at all. In fact, they're making it worse.
Yeah.
Yep. That's the hope.
Yeah, well, and I think that it would be a disaster for what Trump wants to do with the climate, which is essentially ignore it.
Hmm.
It's the worst possible thing that could happen. the
Right.
absolute worst, just in terms of, I mean, that would be apocalyptic right there.
Right.
You
Hmm.
know,
Right.
um,
Oh yeah.
yeah,
It,
and
this ties right into the environmental apocalypse, right?
yeah. Well, and talk about immigration. That's actually going to be in the coming years, climate refugees.
Yep.
Yes.
What's going to happen? I'm still expecting sometime in the near future that Miami's just going to be underwater and it's never going
Yep.
to recover.
Mm-hmm.
And a
Yeah.
lot of the other coastal cities. So what, and around the world. So what's going to happen? We've already seen this in the war in Turkey. One idea was that it was in large part being driven by a massive drought. And so you had all these climate refugees coming in, and then the response was
Mm-hmm.
war.
Right.
So what's going to happen when, within individual nations, because I imagine that we're going to see movement within the United States. I mean, where do
Mm-hmm.
people in Miami go to? Where are the
Minnesota.
people in Louisiana, New Orleans going to go to? And Los
Hmm.
Angeles, they're going to have to start moving in, and then you're going to have all these like dead zones almost.
Right.
And we're going to lose the ability, California, we talked about this before with all, first you've got droughts and you've rains, and, the whole Central Valley was, with the latest floods, was going to turn into a lake again. You can't grow
Mm-hmm.
food there.
Right.
You can't grow food there.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
going to be
Absolutely.
very shifting, and we just we don't have any grown-ups in the room.
Mhm.
True. Yeah.
Yeah. Someone needs to just say it. This is what's happening. This is how it's going to get worse. This is how we can't do anything about it. And here's what we can do about it.
Yeah.
It's,
Mhm.
someone's got to sit us down with a serenity prayer or something.
Yeah.
And we're just going to have to face the demons and stop shifting blame, stop
Right.
acting like it's not going to occur. We wish hard enough and click our heels together.
Mm-hmm. Thoughts
Um,
and prayers.
thoughts and prayers. It's going to have to be an effort just to survive,
Mm.
right? Because we already know that a certain amount of heat is built in. We know that we're going to get 1.5 degrees. We can't avoid it. Right now we're at what 1.1,
Yeah.
and this is what we're seeing.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So as we go forward, and we most people don't think we could stop it at 1.5. It will go to 2 to 2.5 maybe. Um, and then the rest is up to us what we decide to do. So if we're talking about, the American apocalypse is really the world apocalypse in
Yeah.
that, not that we necessarily drive everything, but if we sit here and say we don't have to prepare for this, we don't have to do anything for this, what's it going
Right.
to do across the globe?
Right.
You
And
know,
what was the
uh,
group you mentioned earlier? The Millerites or something, where they didn't do anything for the winter?
yeah, the Millerites did
That's
not
us, right?
plan, yeah, for the winter. They didn't,
Right.
have the hay ready for the animals. They didn't, can anything, and there they found themselves without anything to get them through.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Um,
That that's an
which,
excellent analogy for our situation at the moment.
Right.
I think. Yeah. You got to write an article about that stuff.
yeah, I mean the despair was palpable of what they felt, because what are you going to do? Some of them just starved to death.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, it's you have to prepare for these things, and
Yeah.
a Trump administration is an apocalyptic choice.
Mm.
You
Right.
know, it's we choose. I guess we choose death.
Yeah.
Over doing something about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's very disheartening, and that's putting it mildly. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, I don't know. I see a lot of I see this in my students that there's I think there's a lot of anger and not knowing where to go, and there's like rejections of the system in a way, but there's this feeling of powerlessness.
Right.
And I've apologized to my students a lot. I'm like, I am so sorry that you aren't inheriting the world that you're inheriting, because it feels like it's out of our control in many ways. And the best that we can do right now is the only voice that we have is in voting.
Right.
And so just encourage everyone to vote. I know that seems like we had one comment on the YouTube, which was not a positive comment, but I do want to encourage everybody to vote. That's important, and to try our best, to figure out what's true and what's not, and don't be manipulated. Don't be manipulated.
Yeah.
Look at what's actually going on.
And I would say that no matter who wins the
Yeah.
election,
Yeah.
no matter who comes out ahead, you got to keep these people that's winning the election is the first step,
Right.
but then you have
Right.
to keep their feet to the fire. Are you doing anything to combat climate change?
Yeah.
Are you doing anything to help with, the price of groceries, the price, keeping roofs over our heads? What are you doing about all of that?
Right.
And it doesn't matter if it's, Trump or if it's Harris, there are problems with the Democrats not doing enough to address what's going on. And that's
Yeah.
why Trump has a following.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. There's, what I keep saying is I understand. I mean, on one level I can understand. On another level I can't.
Right.
From the time he made fun of the guy, the disabled reporter, from that moment on, I'm like, how can you do that? How? No,
Right.
the man has no virtue, and that's supposed to be something that is necessary for a republic to survive.
Right.
I've thought long and hard about it, and I cannot identify a single virtue of that man, which is why I'm like, yeah, he's anti-Christ, nothing about it. So yeah. Interesting times that we live in. Isn't that
Right.
the old curse?
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, Jeremy, Stephanie, thank you again for joining me on the Cocktail Apocalypse.
You bet. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, I want to try that Ruth Bader ginger now. And what's your YouTube channel again, Jeremy?
Kill Devil Rum and Cocktails. And it's kill as in kill someone. Well, I shouldn't say that on YouTube.
Yeah, you
but
should not say
kill,
that.
KILL-DIVILL. And I'll put a link in the comments down below just so people can get to it pretty easy.
All right, perfect. Yeah, go visit Jeremy's YouTube channel, like and subscribe, and as well here, Rebel Spirit Radio. We do the Cocktail Apocalypse almost every second Saturday of the month. Sometimes we have to reschedule due to personal issues, but we do try to come out every month. And there are new episodes of the Rebel Spirit Radio podcast that are released every Friday. So please like and subscribe to that as well. Any final thoughts? Before we stop this?
I think we're good.
Yeah.
I think we're good. Go vote and
Yeah.
like and subscribe.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you both very much.
Thank you, Nick.
All right.
Thank you.
Let's see here.